Michael, thank you so much for having covered the whole ground so beautifully. So, what I suggest that we take two questions at a time, and then we come back. Arno is inscribed. You can either speak in English or Portuguese, but please be concise.
I will be concise, but I have three questions. Okay.
I see a contradiction in there.
Have Europeans forgotten history? I mean, the European Union hasn't come out of nothing. Okay, it's a post-Second World War project for Europe. Have they forgotten history? You haven't spoken very much about Germany, which still is a big supporter and sponsor of the European Union. What is the real role of Germany in your scenario? It didn't appear here, okay? And the third question is there a possibility of a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons in the UK to throw Boris Johnson out and have a new elections?
You have stolen everybody else's thunder, so back to you.
Well, we could have a seminar on each of these questions, I think. But your first question touches on a major preoccupation of mine. Let me start with a small anecdote, and that is I was really surprised when my younger son, when he was 14, and being educated in the British school of Brussels, like all British high school students, had to choose either history or geography. And he chose geography, which means that his knowledge of history stopped at the age of 14. This is true of all British, except in some private schools. More generally, I am convinced that the loss of history is contributing to our political difficulties today. And I think that when political figures take some of the positions they've taken, they are simply not aware. I think if any social scientists were able to conduct an inquiry among political leaders today, and they asked them to give a brief description of some of the major developments in 20th century history, they couldn't do it. You know, when the British Home Secretary, the previous British Home Secretary, Interior Minister, a few years ago, asked all companies in Britain to send lists of staff who were migrants to the government, and people over my age, raised their eyebrows because they thought, what does this remind us of? Lists of illegal immigrants being sent by companies to the government. I think when she proposed that, she had no historical understanding or sensitivity. And the idea that the EU is a peace project and that it was the framework for reconciliation after the Second World War and after the Cold War, I'm afraid all of that has been quite widely lost. And even in member states other than Britain, I don't think that that sense is very strong today for a number of reasons. So yes, I am very concerned about the loss of the sense of history, and I think that has contributed. Germany has been the main bulwark of European integration for years and years. I mean, ever since the European project began, I think because Germany's return to the family of European nations after the Second World War was very much linked to European integration. The introduction of the euro was mainly a political project, I think, on Germany's side. And Germany has always been counted on as perhaps the strongest supporter for European integration of any member state. This still is just about the case, but I think it's changing. I think it changed with Schröder and maybe even more with Merkel. And whatever their personal views, we are seeing now political movements arise even in Germany that are not strongly committed to the European project, and even in some cases, like the Alternative for Germany, A4D, opposing it or opposing some aspects of it. And I think that if Germany ever did waver in its own support for European integration, then the caprices of other member states would seem much more serious. And let's see what the future developments are within Germany. What are the prospects of the House of Commons in Britain voting no confidence in Boris Johnson and bringing this process of Brexit to an end? Very slight, unfortunately. And even though there would be a majority in the House of Commons for remaining in the EU, and there have already been votes in the House of Commons against a no-deal Brexit, the problem is that the opposition to Boris Johnson's policies is divided. And Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, has put himself forward as a potential alternative prime minister, even for a transitional period, if people would support him, and made a bid for support from Liberal Democrats, Scottish Nationalists, Greens, and others. And this is simply rejected by even some in his own party who don't agree with his policy positions on a whole range of issues. So I'm afraid that because of divisions amongst the opposition, we're not likely to see the House of Commons blocking a hard Brexit. Maybe as the date approaches, this might change. But Boris Johnson will do whatever he can to prevent an opportunity arising for them to do so, and particularly to prevent legislation going to the House of Commons that could be amended by a majority to include clauses providing for either a soft Brexit or requiring the government to enter into a negotiation or to hold a new referendum. So I don't think we can count on the House of Commons to stop the process.
Very good. Who else? There. Você leva o microfone lá?
Professor, could you? Is there a scenario in which the non-deal Brexit could in any way affect the common defense strategy, NATO, and so on? I mean, could this create a situation in which the pillar for the common defense strategy of Europe is shattered or balanced by any way?
Anyone else? Second? Okay. David, there. Where's the mic? Traz aqui o...
Thank you. Just to pick up on the third of the previous set of questions, maybe take it a bit further. We're in a moment, I think, when pretty much every citizen in both Brazil and in the UK are a sort of amateur constitutional lawyer at the same time, right? So I'm just interested to hear your views in the UK on the possibility of the sort of constitutional law debate actually blocking Brexit. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about possible initiatives around that. I just wonder what you have to say on its effectiveness or not.
Okay. Back to you, then we carry on later.
Okay, well, thank you for these two questions. On defense, there are 2 points of view. There is one point of view that Britain has been an obstacle to the European Union really developing its proclaimed common security and defense policy. And that because Britain has always advocated principally support for NATO, the UK has been seen as an obstacle. So some believe that without the UK, the EU is much more likely to go ahead with initiatives like PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, trying to bring the armaments industries together in different member states, that other EU initiatives on security and defense will now go forward with greater urgency and more support in the absence of Britain. The other point of view on this issue is that in reality, even though Britain has opposed some initiatives, It has been an active participant in the common security and defence policy until now, and especially the UK military has been an essential component in any European claim. And the British have participated in various missions, the anti-piracy missions of East Africa, peacekeeping missions in Africa and elsewhere. And that without British participation, this policy lacks credibility. And that Britain, once it's left, will be much more inclined to try and centre all security and defence efforts on NATO, of which it is a member, rather than the European Union. Now, when this process began, the previous Prime Minister, Thereza May, said that she wanted a deep relationship with the European Union after Brexit, including the area of security and defence, and that we could expect to see very strong bilateral agreements and cooperation continuing in this area. Well, I think if there's a no-deal Brexit, that will at least be postponed for several years. It will take several years for the dust to settle, and the EU is going to feel very bruised if there really is a no-deal Brexit. So I think the notion that the EU could play a serious complementary role to NATO could be at least a short-term victim of Brexit. And without the UK, there will be a number of initiatives, but not in the area of primary defence, rather in steps towards avoiding duplication in the defence industry and towards further missions, civilian and military missions around the world where the need arises, but not a full-bodied defence mission. This is particularly ironic, as one of the lies that were told in the referendum campaign, including by Boris Johnson, was that the EU was about to create a European army, something that wasn't true then and is not true now. On the unwritten British Constitution, the situation is clearly in flux, and constitutional issues may be brought up as part of this debate. I mean, particularly the notion that it is for the executive alone to propose legislation that can be amended, and therefore that would be potentially used by those opposed to Brexit. Much is going to depend on the attitude of the chair, the president of the British Parliament, the Speaker of the House of Commons, who has, with a great deal of gusto and enthusiasm, adopted a very visible role in all of this. And he seems willing to entertain the introduction of resolutions that could be amended, even on the initiative of the Parliament itself, which previously would have been regarded as contrary to constitutional traditions, to the point where some describe this as Parliament seeking to seize control of its agenda that was previously controlled by the executive. So these issues are there. And if, by some miracle, the divisions in the opposition were to be overcome, and if there were to be a kind of temporary alliance between the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Scottish Nationalists, and the Greens, who together would have a majority in the House of Commons, and would try then to see legislation adopted that prevented a hard Brexit, or even called upon the government to re-enter negotiations, or heaven forbid, and most unlikely, to revoke the notification, we would then have a full-scale constitutional crisis. So these issues are on the table.
All right, one more. Okay. Wow. Let's start here. Yeah. And then there.
Sir Michael, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I'd like to pick your brains also a little bit as we hear as on your feeling on the Mercosur European Union agreement, what you think next steps could be and are, and the risks.
All right. Yeah. Adil.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'm José Maria from Faculdade Rio Branco. I'd like to know how your scenarios consider the reform of European Union institutions in the context of relaunch or consolidation. I guess these are the two scenarios for reform in the institutions, but I'd like to know a little more about that. Thanks.
Okay, back to you, Michael.
Was there one more? I think there was.
Okay, one more. There are two here, actually.
Parabéns pela apresentação. Gostaria.
Espera um pouquinho, Orteio. Só...
Okay. Parabéns pela apresentação.
Okay.
Eu gostaria de fazer um comentário e uma pergunta rápida. O senhor falou dos problemas do sistema democrático quando falou do referendo. 52% votou sim, porém, de fato, era 37% do colégio eleitoral. É um problema que não só na Inglaterra, mas no Brasil, na América Latina, isso está acontecendo. No Brasil, foi 57% para o presidente, porém, esse colégio eleitoral realmente foi 38%, 39% que elegeu o presidente. No entanto, ele fala que pode fazer tudo e que não estiver de acordo, sai do governo ou sai do país. Então, a minha pergunta é, o senhor vê alguma ideia de superação de um problema desse de representação política democrática no sentido do sistema como um todo? E concordar, você fez uma pergunta sobre as três opções: consolidação, desintegração ou, digamos assim,
Relançamento.
ficaria com eu responderia, do meu ponto de vista, um palpite. Eu ficaria com a terceira, o senhor estaria de acordo?
E seria, a terceira seria consolidação.
Correto.
Tá certo. Mais uma aqui, ali.
Valdomiro, ex-professor da PUC, mais uma curiosidade. Como a monarca, a rainha ou a sua corte opinam sobre o Brexit, ou se não podem opinar? É uma curiosidade.
Obrigado. Back to you, Michael.
I didn't quite get it.
Whether the Queen and other members of the royalty, whether they do share
Okay.
their opinions about Brexit or not.
Okay. Maybe I'll take those questions in reverse order. The Queen and the royal family. Well, Britain is a constitutional monarchy, and therefore the royal family is not expected to take a position. And everyone has their own views as to what they may or may not believe. But until now, there is no role in this. It's wishful thinking, I think, in some quarters, that if we reached a very difficult moment, and for example, it was a question of who might form a new government, that the Queen might play some kind of role. I think it's only at the moment when a new government is formed and there's some element of uncertainty as to who is in a position to form a majority, that the royal family could in principle have a very small influence, but very small indeed. So I don't think that the royal family is going to step in to save us from this situation or to tilt the balance one way or the other. Concerning small majorities or pluralities determining important outcomes in democracies, I think on the whole, this is something we have to accept. And every political system has its anomalies. I think on the whole, as long as these anomalies are known and understood in advance, and they form part of the rules of the game, they are perceived as legitimate. I mean, for example, in the United States, the fact that Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump in the presidential election, but lost the Electoral College, was broadly regarded as legitimate in the United States, even though people raised their eyebrows and some had their own theories as to how this happened. So in general, I think if the rules of the game are known, even though each system has its own peculiarities, then the public will accept the outcome as legitimate. But what I was saying was, when a major constitutional change is at stake, I am not sure that the public generally will recognize the legitimacy of the outcome if it was only a plurality of the electorate. And to be sure, a bit less than 52% of those voting voted in this way. I mean, let me give you another example that I didn't mention until now, but in the notion that there might be a crisis of democracy is the method in the UK under our unwritten constitution whereby the Prime Minister is chosen. Because Boris Johnson has become Prime Minister without an election. I mean, Thereza May resigned as leader of the Conservative Party. There was a competition in the House of Commons. The House of Commons reduced the candidates to 2. And then there was a vote by the members of the Conservative Party. There are approximately 100,000 of these people participated in the vote, and approximately 80,000 people, 80 in a country of 65 million, voted in favor of Boris Johnson as the next leader of the Conservative Party. And then, being the leader of the party that controlled the House of Commons, he automatically became Prime Minister. Now, this is part of the British rules of the game. But given what is at stake now, I do think that people could start asking some pretty fundamental questions about the British Constitution and whether some kind of adaptation might need to be made. The question about possible reform of the EU institutions and whether under any of these scenarios there might be a major movement towards reform. I would say at the moment, the main sort of reform idea on the table was put forward by Emmanuel Macron, and that was the idea that the European Parliament should henceforth be constituted by transnational groups, and that elections to the European Parliament should be with transnational constituencies and not just in each country according to its own national politics. And this, broadly speaking, has failed until now, even though to a very limited extent in 20 constituencies in this last election, there was such an element. We see now a former Italian European Affairs minister becoming the main advisor to the French president, being an Italian citizen, on European affairs. So there are small symbolic steps in this direction. But I don't think any significant reforms of the institutions will be on the table now, because it would be so hard to reach a consensus, almost impossible to reach a consensus. And if a new treaty were required, as I've said, it would be almost impossible to ratify a new treaty at this stage. EU-Mercosur, I think, is very interesting and important from a number of points of view. In terms of my presentation, trade is one of the areas where the EU can still be active and effective even under the third consolidation scenario. And just this year, the EU has concluded important agreements with Japan, Vietnam, and with Mercosur. So I think that one can see trade policy as continuing to be important, and it's also one of the few areas where the member states have delegated pretty much full responsibility to the European Commission for the negotiations, even though they follow through. And a very important development in Europe has been, compared with previous trade agreements, this agreement can be ratified just by the EU institutions. It doesn't have to be ratified by every member state. Therefore, the chances of seeing the agreement approved on the European side are greater than in the past. Just to say, there is opposition in Europe. And the two main sources of opposition are anti-globalists who believe that this is not in Europe's economic interests, and they believe that the clauses in the agreement on environmental, labor, and data protection will be hard to enforce, or the debates about the Amazon and so on. So we're going to see opposition from, broadly speaking, the anti-globalists, and we'll see opposition in Europe also from some agricultural interests, particularly French agriculture. But on the European side, there's an expectation that the agreement would greatly benefit European industry, financial services, some agricultural exporters, wine, cheese, olive oil, specialty agricultural exports. So there will be real benefits on the European side, and I think that opposition will be a minority. So other things being equal, I think one could expect to see it eventually concluded, signed, and ratified on the European side. You know better than I do how things look on the Mercosur side. I think one of our main concerns has to be the position of Argentina after the upcoming elections. Let's wait and see. I mean, Brazil is clearly the main partner within Mercosur and, you know, the main negotiating partner for the EU. And I think Brazil would stand to benefit significantly in its exports to the European Union. Now, whether those views will prevail or whether within Mercosur itself we're going to see a chipping away of support, I can't judge. But I think the Mercosur agreement is very important in the absence of further progress in the World Trade Organization. And given that if Donald Trump is re-elected, he may actually seek to dismantle some of the main remaining multilateral institutions, including the WTO. And one of the interesting features of EU-Mercosur is that it is region to region. It's not purely bilateral. Because the EU's vision is that in the absence of a new WTO round, a series of wide-ranging bilateral agreements could eventually lead to a more multilateral approach. And I think the EU-Mercosur agreement is really indicative of that. So I think in Europe we're going to see support despite the opposition, and I hope that will be the case here too, but that remains to be seen.
All right, we have time for one more question. Medina here.
It is just a question. How do you consider the possibility of a more pragmatic decision or solution, for example, to postpone, to have agreement with the EU to postpone the Brexit for the next 5 or 10 years? In that way, you can have all those issues that you showed us would be more mature, and also you can leave it for the next old guys.
There's one major problem with your proposal, and that is it's based on rationality. And one of the things we've learned is that, unfortunately, decisions are being taken more on emotional and identity grounds rather than rational grounds. I think that would make sense, maybe not 5 years, but clearly for a certain period, to enable this agreement to be reviewed. And yes, I mean, that would make perfect sense. But unfortunately, it's not le parfum du temps. That's not the nature of politics today. And I'm afraid decisions will be taken more in the short-term interests or the perceived short-term interests of the main political actors rather than the interests of the country. And what we've seen is the willingness to set aside national interests, for example, the unity of the United Kingdom, in favor of short-term political considerations. And I greatly fear that that will prevail.
Would you, one final question, Michael, if you allow me. In this context, would you dare saying that from the perspective of the future of the European Union, as we know it, hard Brexit with its chaotic consequences would be preferable than sort of endless procrastination of the current situation?
Certainly many Europeans are completely fed up with the Brexit question, which they see as a distraction from other more important questions. And on the British side, the equivalent, in terms of your question, is the notion that we want a clean break. But I think this is an illusion, because integration now has been going on for almost half a century, and the two sides are very closely interlocked whatever happens. So in fact, what will happen in the event of a hard Brexit is that there will be chaos, there will be huge queues at borders, there will be real problems, and then a wholly new negotiation will start. And that will be to cope with the short-term problems, but also to negotiate the long-term future relationship. And so, like it or not, Brexit is going to be with the EU for the best part of the next decade, one way or the other. So even though people might be yearning to put this behind them and get on with more important questions, I'm afraid Brexit is still going to be influencing the political priorities within Europe for quite some time to come.
But don't you think that people tend to learn the hard way? So in the face of the chaotic consequences of the hard Brexit, that would teach some people a lesson that might feed into a more constructive negotiation afterwards.
Yes, I do agree with that. That will happen. And, you know, if one were Boris Johnson, heaven forbid, but if I were Boris Johnson, what would I want more than anything else? I would want to remain Prime Minister for the next 5 years. I would want to have an election and to have a majority in Parliament and to realize my lifetime ambition of emulating Winston Churchill and being Prime Minister of my country for a long period. So what would be most conducive to that? And probably once he's delivered his Brexit, and even if there's short-term chaos, and if he wins an election, at that point, it would be in his interest as well to engage with the EU and to try and resolve all those issues and to build a long-term relationship. I'm involved in a project which is a simulation of a future science agreement between the EU and the UK. And scientists on both sides have an enormous interest in continuing to cooperate. So I think that there's not going to be a clean break. Whatever happens, the UK will remain engaged with the European Union. There will be a difficult period. There will be a price to pay. But although it's a cliche, the UK may be leaving the EU, but not Europe. And come what may, I think the two will remain intertwined for the indefinite future.
I ask people to join me in a round of applause to our excellent guest speaker.